We are wrapping up today a series that we've been doing through one of the most famous stories Jesus has ever taught. The Prodigal Son is what it's known by. If it's in your Bible in Luke chapter 15, if you want to go ahead and open there. If you don't own a Bible, we would love to give you a Bible as you leave today. Just let one of our team members know. We'll have a Bible that we can give you. We'll also put these verses on the screen as we get to them. You know, when we think about America and Independence Day and watermelon fireworks and 4th of July and all the great things that go along, apple pie, I think about the hometown I was raised in. I was raised in a very small town. It's actually not even a town. It's officially a village. The village of Arcanum, Ohio. It is just kind of northwest of Dayton in Darke County, Ohio, and farm country, a lot of corn, a lot of soybeans. In this little town where I grew up, it was just what you would see in the movies. There was one traffic light in the town. That was it. A lot of the roads were brick. There was a general store that still had the ladder that went up, and the store clerk would climb the ladder to get canned goods off the top, and they would bring them down. And there was a charge account, so when my mom needed me to go to the store, she would just send me to the store on my bike, and we just charge it, and then my mom would settle up the bill. There was one school in the whole town. It was K through 12, and so this was when I went to school and started in kindergarten. My uncle was a senior in high school, and he was 7 foot tall and the star of the basketball team, which means all the high school girls that were in love with him were also in love with his little kindergarten nephew. So I loved that town, and I loved that school. It was a great place to grow up. The rule was I had to be home when the street lights came on. It was that kind of town. There was the iconic building is the county courthouse, the sheriff's office, and the jail. It's all in one building, and they've got the two cells there, just kind of like when you watch Andy Griffith. That was the town. It was a great town. And over the years, I've had opportunities to go back to that town, and I've always been disappointed. Every time I go back, I'm disappointed. I've gone back, and the last time I was there were 3 stoplights. They had paved over all the brick, with asphalt and widened the roads. The one school that was there has been torn down and replaced by 2 or 3 different schools in different parts of the county. The Smith's grocery store where I used to go is now a museum, and there's this big, Walmart super center on the edge of town. And it's just different. It's not the same. When I go by the house I grew up in and I look at it, I used to think it was this palace, and it's a little tiny shack almost. It's so small. And I realize as I'm going through this town, the few times I've done it, that in fact the town has changed, but it hasn't changed as much as I've changed. That had I been in the town with all the other people that I grew up with, I would have seen all of those changes as progress. But as somebody who left, who thought it should just stay frozen in time the way I knew it and remembered it, the reality is I was disappointed every time I went. And the truth is, it was never as good as I actually remembered it being. It was never that town. It was never that way. We have this way, this fanciful way in life of making things better than they actually were. Have you had this experience? Like you've gone back to something, you're like, I really loved that. And then you go, you take your kids back and you tell them, you're like, yeah, I'm not sure why I love that so much. I'm not sure what was so great about that. Or if you watched a movie, like if you're as old as I am, you grew up and you loved some of those 80s movies, and then you think it'll be fun to watch it again, and you're like, how in the world did I watch this movie? Those things just aren't as good as we thought they were. And that is so often true about home. This longing and desire that we have to go home, but when we get there, we find that we're disappointed. The author Thomas Wolfe said, you can never go home. And after going back to my hometown a few times, I've discovered that to be true, that I could never go home. It's just not the same. And in fact, it was not that from the beginning. Tim Keller says this, we're always traveling, never arriving. The houses and families we actually inhabit are only inns along the way, but they aren't home. Home continues to evade us. I think there's something really true about that. There is something about the idea of home that is constantly evading us. Because even if you grew up in a good home, you grew up with great parents, a good family, you were surrounded by good people, there was still some ideal about a better home than that inside your mind and heart. There was always some friend or neighbor you thought, man, I wish I were in that family. I wish I had those parents. I wish that was my brother. I wish that was my sister. There's always this thing, no matter how good it is, there's always this thing inside of us that is longing for a better home. a better family, that we're longing for something that we just can't quite grasp. We can't just get a hold of. And then you get older and you think, okay, well, I'm going to make that kind of home. I'm going to make that kind of family. But it doesn't ever quite work out as good as you thought it would work out. There's always something about us that is longing for something better than what we have. That home evades us. C.S. Lewis said this: our lifelong nostalgia, our longing to be reunited with something in the universe from which we feel cut off, to be on the inside of some door which we have always seen from the outside, is no mere neurotic fantasy, but the truest index of our real situation. What Lewis means is that God has placed something inside of every human heart. Doesn't matter if you're a believer in Jesus or not. Doesn't matter if you call yourself religious or not. Doesn't matter if you're a person of faith or not. God has placed something inside of every human being that longs for something that we can't quite find here. The desire to go home comes from a deep longing to be in a place we've never actually been, but where we were always meant to be. There is such a home. There is such a place. And that desire that you have that never is fully satisfied, that desire that you have that sometimes drives you to look for that home in destructive and hurtful places, that desire was put in you by God to draw you to a home that this world can never provide for you. So I want us to look at this passage one last time, Luke chapter 15, the story of the prodigal son. And for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it's such a famous and popular story that popular literature, popular culture, movies, stories, TV shows, many of them have made reference to this, but it's the story of a father who has two sons. And the younger son decides that he is looking for something better than his father's house. He's looking for something better than working for his dad. He's looking for something other than what he has. And so he decides he's going to strike out on his own. So he goes to his dad and he says, "Hey, Dad, give me my share of the inheritance." And so the father, miraculously, unbelievably, gives him his share of the inheritance early. And so this young man goes off with the money that he's got, and he's going to look for this ideal. He's going to look for something better than he's ever had before. But you know what happens? He ends up wasting all of his money. He blows it. He tries to find this satisfaction in women. He tries to find it in alcohol. He tries to find it in partying. He tries to find it in luxury. He tries to find it in pleasure and satisfaction. But he never finds it. And where he ends up is destitute, feeding a bunch of pigs, longing to just eat what they're eating. And then Jesus says this in Luke 15, verse 17. When he came to his senses, he got up and went to his father. When he came to his senses. Let me ask you a question. When did you come to your senses? Or have you come to your senses? I mean, when was the time that you woke up and you recognized that this world could never satisfy the deepest longing and desires of your heart? When did you come to your senses and finally know that there would never be enough stuff, never enough money, never enough fame, never enough power, never enough sex, never enough pleasure, that there would always be this desire in you for something more than you can ever find satisfaction for in this world? That the more you got of this world, that your appetite only grew bigger and bigger? That the more you took, the less you were satisfied? When did you come to your senses? Or have you? Have you finally realized that more money in the bank account's not going to do it? That a different spouse isn't going to do it? Smarter kids, a better job, a bigger house, a better church? That there's nothing that's going to satisfy that longing. When did you wake up and come to your senses? You see, we want health and beauty, but we all grow old and weak. We work for money and riches only to see it lost or given to somebody else when we die. We dedicate ourselves to career only to be replaced by technology or somebody who's younger and smarter than we are. We want to be the people we love. We want to be with the people we love forever. But in the end, they always leave. Either by choice or by death, they always leave. C.S. Lewis says, if we long for things this world cannot satisfy, it's only because we were made for a different world. That God put those longings and desires in your heart, that longing and desire for beauty, that longing and desire for youth, that longing and desire for pleasure, that longing and desire is put inside of you to draw you not to anything in this world, but to draw you to himself. And the deepest longing of our hearts will only be satisfied in God. See, here's the secret. Our home is not a place, it's a person. Your home is not a place. It's a person. And here is the most fantastic reality of all, that God is that person. He is longing and waiting for your arrival. Look what it says in verse 20 of chapter 15. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Everything this young man had been looking for was always available to him in his father. It was always right there. And he went off to search for it in all these other places. And when he came back, what he discovered is that nothing in the world was ultimately going to bring that satisfaction. It was only available to him in his father. And what was more amazing is that even after he squandered his father's wealth, his father is still waiting there, looking out over the horizon, longing day after day after day for his son to come home. And the minute he sees him coming, he runs to his son. That's what God is doing for you. He's longing for you to finally come to your senses and realize that there's nothing in this world that is ever going to fully satisfy and fulfill you. See, whereas our attempts to return home often lead to disappointment, our return to God is always better than we expected. See, this son went home expecting a lecture, but the father gave him his affection. The son planned to offer an excuse, but the father provided a feast. The son expected to be a slave, and the father made him the guest of honor at a great party. It's not the homecoming he expected, and it won't be the homecoming you expect either. In fact, when you look at the Bible, especially the teachings of Jesus, you see a common thread that runs throughout the scripture, and it's this idea of a party. Now, I know if you're somebody who's not a Christian, not a believer, especially not a Baptist, you might not think that's true about the Christian faith. You might not think that's true about Jesus followers, that they're a bunch, stuck up, the people who don't have any fun. In fact, they're killjoys. They seek to always killjoy. But those people aren't reading about the same Jesus I read about. Because the Jesus I read about kept getting in trouble with religious people for having parties with people he shouldn't have been hanging out with. That Jesus consistently, through his life and in the stories he told, was having all these wild parties. He was engaged. That's why the religious people didn't like him, didn't trust him. In fact, the very first miracle we have recorded of Jesus is Jesus goes to a mediocre party and turns some water into wine and turns it into a great party. Jesus tells these stories over and over again because he wants to paint a picture in the minds and hearts of his followers about a party that is coming, about an experience that is better than any you'll have here, about a time where you can be united with the people you love and experience fullness of joy and deep satisfaction. Another one of these stories Jesus told is found in Matthew chapter 22. It's the story of a king who was throwing a giant feast, and he sent invitations out to all the right people, all the people, who were influential, all the people who were powerful, all the people that you wanted at the party, the A-listers. He sent this invitation out, and many of those people ended up not coming because of different excuses. And this is what it says in Matthew 22, verse 8. Then he said to his servants, "The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find." So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. That's a strange thing to say, isn't it? That the wedding hall was filled with the bad and the good. That everybody was welcome into the party. Everybody was welcome to come into this party. Those who were invited, those who were originally invited, wouldn't come. But those who should never have been invited ended up becoming the guests of honor. And the only condition for invitation appears to be a willingness to attend the party. That's it. You want to come? Come. You want to come? Come on. Yeah, you want to come to the party? Come to the party. This is the story of a lavish, prodigal God who is throwing open the doors wide and saying, come, everybody come. You who are thirsty, come. You who are hungry, come. You who are downcast and outcast, come. Come to the party. And the only qualification is your willingness to respond. Remember, this story is about two sons. And the older son was not willing to come. Verse 28 of Luke 15 says, the older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. Do you notice the similarity in the father's response to these two sons? That he's standing on the porch overlooking the horizon, longing for his younger son to come home. And then when he's in the party, he's so aware of the fact that his older son wasn't there. That the father is constantly aware of when one of his sons is not in his presence. Just like God is consciously aware when you are absent, when you have run, when you won't come in. And just like this father, he comes out to the proud and says, son, please come into the party. One of the things this reminds me, these two parables, but others, Matthew 22, Luke 15, and many others, it reminds me that people are not excluded from heaven because they aren't welcome, but because they refuse to accept God's invitation. Let me just say that for you one more time, because for some of you, maybe you've heard something different. Maybe you've experienced something different in a church. You've heard it from people who do what I do or people who claim to be Christians. Listen, people are not excluded from heaven because they aren't welcome. They're excluded because they refuse to accept God's invitation to come in. There are those who would say that Christianity is the most exclusive of all religions. That's not true. Christianity is the most inclusive of any worldview that exists. Because Christianity is for everyone. It doesn't matter what language you speak, what color your skin is, what country you're from, how rich you are, how poor you are. Doesn't matter what you've done, where you've been. The invitation is for everybody, the good and the bad. The younger son who runs away and the older son who never went anywhere. But people refuse to come. Why? Well, maybe they're too distracted. We've all been distracted, right? We're too distracted pursuing those things that we think are going to satisfy what we're longing for. So we're out trying to make more money. We're out trying to get a better job. We're out doing all these things to try to meet this satisfaction, and we're too distracted to come home. Or maybe they don't come because they don't like who else has been invited. I mean, come on, admit it. You've not gone to parties because you didn't like somebody else who was on the guest list. I know you've done that. We've all done that. But what if the same thing were true about heaven? What if your ex-wife is there? What if that person that you really don't like at work is there? What if that's the point? The good and the bad are there, and if you're too good to go hang out with the bad, maybe you don't want to come in. That's what the religious leaders in Jesus' day did. They were constantly standing on the outside, looking in, pointing fingers, saying, we don't want to be associated with those people, and so therefore they were unwilling to accept Jesus' invitation. Or maybe people just refuse to come on God's terms. Well, what are God's terms? That you come, that you accept the invitation that he's offered through Jesus Christ, through his death on the cross, his death and resurrection. That's it. That's all God's terms. So as we wrap up this message and as we wrap up this series on the prodigal son, I want to end by just sharing some thoughts about heaven. Who's in, who's out, and what may be coming. And here's why I think this is important, maybe on the 4th of July, as we celebrate our country's independence. Because I hope you know we have much to celebrate about our nation. We have much to be grateful for. People who have sacrificed and who have worked and are still working to see that we live in a society that's free and open, a society where anybody can come and make a better life for themselves. And the freedom that we experience has been paid for over the centuries. Those are valuable gifts. But you do know that this is not your home, right? You do know, as good as this home is, it will never ultimately satisfy the deepest longing and desires of your heart. That there is no nation on earth that will ultimately do that. That we are all longing and hoping for a home and a place that is better than anything any person or government can ever craft or design As great as our founding documents are, they pale in comparison to what God is preparing in his kingdom. And listen, we need to be grateful and we need to celebrate, but we also need to recognize that everything we love about this nation, and even those things about this nation that we wish were better, are only pointing us to a better home, a heavenly home. So let me just share a few thoughts about heaven with you based on this prodigal story. Heaven is a celebration of all the lost things that have been found. I think that may be the most important thing to know about heaven. This celebration of all the lost things that have been found. Remember in Luke chapter 15, the story of the shepherd, and one of the 100 sheep got away, and he left the 99 and went to find the one, and he celebrated that he found the one sheep. The woman who had 10 coins, and she lost one, and she threw a big party for all her neighbors, celebrating that she'd found this lost coin. And the father who welcomes the prodigal son home and throws a party for him in celebration. Heaven is a celebration of lost things that are found. Heaven is a celebration for every lost person who has ever been found. And you've been lost, and I've been lost. We've all been lost. And when we get there, what is celebrated is the fact that we find our way home. That we didn't just satisfy ourselves with the temporary pleasures of this world, the temporary satisfactions that we can find here. That we continued to press on towards that city, that home, that place that God has called us to himself. It's a celebration of all those who are lost who will be found. Here's another thing about heaven that's so important. Everyone's invited, but are free to decline. Everyone's invited, but free to decline. The older brother refused to come in. The guests that the king had invited to the party were too busy to come. They were all invited, but they refused to come. And listen, God's invitation for you to come home is available. But he has also loved you enough that, like the father loved the younger son enough to let him go his own way, he will let you decline the invitation. Anything less than that is not a loving God. How can God truly be loving if he forces his will upon you in this one most critical aspect, the freedom for you to choose to receive his love? This is what God has offered you in Jesus Christ. He's extended his love to you, and he's given you the freedom to accept it, to receive the invitation and to come home, or to decline the invitation. But here's what's amazing. He loves you even when you decline the invitation. Even when you're out searching for satisfaction in something else. Even when you're looking for an earthly home. Even when you are trying to medicate yourself with the pleasures of this world, God still loves you. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. The Father never stopped loving his younger son. Even while he was out enjoying all the pleasures that the world had to offer, even when he was at his lowest at the pig trough, the Father never stopped loving. And you know what? The Father also never stopped loving the older son, even when he refused to come into the party. But he loved them both enough to let them go. And here's the question. Are you willing to receive God's invitation to come home? To be fully and finally satisfied in him alone? Or are you going to go out looking to find this fulfillment, to answer these longings in other places? Or are you going to stand on the side because your pride will not allow you to come in with all of the prodigals who are making their way home? And finally, the church should feel like a homecoming celebration. You think, well, wait a minute. I thought you were going to talk about heaven. I am talking about heaven. See, because I believe that the church is where heaven meets earth. The church is the beginning of heaven's invasion into earth. When Jesus prayed, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, it started with his church. It starts with you. It starts with me. It starts with every church in this city and around the world. That we are places where people's homecoming should be celebrated. Prodigals should be welcomed, and older brothers must make room for them. This is why it doesn't look much like heaven when you have a church that's more interested about judging others and keeping others out than celebrating it when they're willing to come home. See, that's not heaven. If we want to reflect heaven on earth, we've got to be a people that stand on the porches of our churches, overlooking our city streets and the skyline, and looking over the river and looking down the alleys into all the back corners of the city, longing for the prodigal to come home. And when he does, when she does, we celebrate. And they come just as they were. They come straight out of the pig trough. And we welcome them that way. Because that's what heaven is about. See, one of the things that we say here is more than just a catchy slogan, but we aspire to love everyone always. We aspire to love everyone always. And I love the fact that the word aspire is in there. Because you know what? I don't know about you, but I'm having a hard time with that. Any of you having trouble? I mean, it's hard to love everyone always. I've asked our team to create a t-shirt that says, Jesus loves you and I'm trying real hard. But that's what we're called to do as a people. As a people who are supposed to be ushering heaven into earth, ushering God's kingdom into this reality. We are a people who aspire to love everyone all the time. Regardless of where they've been, what they've done, that's what we're called to do. And one of the ways we do that is we aspire to love everyone always by welcoming everyone with inspirational hospitality and respect, whatever their story. Doesn't matter. The doors are open wide to the good and the bad. And you know what? Today, doesn't that describe every one of us? The good and the bad. I don't just mean your neighbor's bad and you're good. I mean, it describes every individual. You are good and you are bad. You have been good and you have been bad. And God welcomed you the way you were. And that's what he's calling us to do as a church. There's a person who has spent his career in life studying churches and what makes a healthy church and what makes churches effective in sharing the gospel. He's a German fellow by the name of Christian Schwartz, and he says this: it can be demonstrated that there is a significant connection between laughter in church and that church's qualitative and numerical growth. It is interesting that such a significant factor, which according to the data definitely has the status of a growth principle, receives almost no mention in church growth literature. Unfeigned, practical love has a divinely generated magnetic power far more effective than many evangelistic programs. Let me just break that down for you. What he's saying is that a church where there is celebration and laughter is more effective than a church with a great evangelism program. Think about that. Why? Why would that be true? Now, this is not just his thought or his thesis. He has proven this. The data backs it up. Why would that be true? I can tell you why. It's a simple answer. Because that's where your heart longs for you to be. Your heart longs to be in a place where your homecoming is celebrated, where there is rejoicing over one lost son who comes home, one sheep who makes its way back, one coin that has been found. That's the story. So our call as a church, as we go through the rest of the summer, into the fall, into whatever future God has for us, our call as a part of Aspire Church, and if you're not a part of Aspire Church, I hope that God will draw you to be a part of a church like this, or you will go somewhere and be a part of making a church like this. Make Aspire Church like heaven by welcoming prodigals and celebrating their return. That's what we're called to do. To make our church more and more like heaven by creating an environment that welcomes every prodigal. And isn't everybody a prodigal? Haven't we all been prodigals? And celebrating their return. I love the fact that one of the consistent comments that we get back from guests is that people are friendly, which is better than what they might otherwise say, that people aren't friendly, right? If you had to make a choice, that's a no-brainer. But here's the secret, is that we do have teams that serve. Many of you here serve on our VIP team. And we call it that because everybody that comes through these doors is a very important person. How do I know that? Because God demonstrated every person's worth by dying for them. That makes them very important. So we have people that serve on that team. But here's the truth. It's all of our responsibility. It's every person who calls themselves a follower of Jesus' responsibility to make everybody else in the family of God feel welcomed and celebrated when they walk through the doors. So my question to you is this. Are you coming to the party? Are you coming to the party? If you are on the outside, let me ask you to consider why. Is it because you, like the younger brother, don't feel worthy? Like, the only home you're ever going to find is only going to be fully and finally satisfied. That desire is only going to be fully and finally satisfied in your Heavenly Father. Why don't you come home? What are you waiting on? What are you looking for? Maybe you just haven't lived long enough to come to your senses and realize there's nothing else that's going to satisfy that. There's nothing else that's going to ultimately and finally satisfy that. Come home. Are you on the outside because you don't like some of the other guests who are here? Maybe you need to spend some time with the Father and invite him to evaluate your own heart, to remind you that you too were the prodigal who needed to be welcomed home when you came home stinking of the pig trough. Why are you standing on the outside? Are you coming to the party? Now, let me just ask again, especially for those of you who call Aspire Church your home. Are you coming to the party, not just showing up, but showing up to celebrate those who once were lost and now are found, including you? Are you coming to the party? Because it's what God's invited you to do. I'm going to